Okay, thank you for joining us for this Hagley History Hangout. I'm Gregory Hargreaves, Program Officer at the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library. Today, I am being joined by Dr. Kevin D. Tennent, Senior Lecturer in Management at the University of York Management School. Now, supported by an exploratory research grant in 2019, Dr. Tennant used Hagley collection materials to investigate industrial democracy in America between 1913 and 1935. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Well, let's begin by defining terms. What do you mean by industrial democracy?
Well, here we mean essentially a kind of form of, well, expressing employee voice in some form. But, well, okay, so there are many broad forms which employee democracy could take, right? So we're probably defining it fairly narrowly in some sense, but we're kind of, in an overall sense, it can be seen as some form of employees having a voice within the way that a business or an organization, so it doesn't have to be a profit making business, but an organization is run in some way. So it's having that kind of input, if you like, into the kind of management process, if you like, which can be useful for employees. Now, the reason that this is quite interesting at the moment, of course, is that this is kind of politically fashionable, right? So we've seen, so the race has moved on now, but we've seen Elizabeth Warren, for example, talking about the need for employee representation plans of some form, employee democracy of some form. In the UK, Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, talked about it as well, got as far as putting the proposal to the Confederation of British Industry, failed there. Bernie Sanders has also talked about this idea in his presidential bids as well. So there's a lot of interest on the kind of broad left and sometimes even on the right to some extent in the possibilities of employee representation and employee democracy in this sense. But the more nuanced question is what kind of form should these organizations take? What should they actually do? Or these parts of organizations take and what they should actually do? And this is kind of more complicated, if you like. So it's we're not kind of here necessarily talking about, say, having cooperatives in the sense that employee cooperatives, for example. This might be a bit different. This would be kind of applying it towards, how do you apply it towards kind of large shareholding organizations where you have diversified ownership and control, for example. So it's thinking about getting into these kind of large Fortune 500 type private sector organizations. So this is actually our kind of starting point, really, is that this is a politically kind of interesting thing at the moment. We're also interested because we started actually looking at corporate governance more broadly. So we participated in, Andrew Smith and I participated in, Jason Russell, who worked with us on this part of the project as well. We participated in an event at the Seattle University Law School 2 years ago. And every year they have a Berla symposium. And this year it was a 10th anniversary symposium, and they decided to look at kind of corporate governance historically. So we kind of got involved because we were interested in looking at the Berlin Means book from 1932 and the kind of questions that had asked about US corporate governance. So the shift from kind of a shareholder maximization model towards more of a stakeholder one, you see going through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and then sort of slowly shifting backwards again. So certainly after 1970 and 1980, more so back towards a shareholder maximization model. And now you have kind of academics saying that shareholder maximization is the normative model, right? So we were interested in that kind of area of it. And then one of the things that interested us about this was that Berlin means, so where you have systems in continental Europe, particularly, so Germany, for instance, being the most classic example, to some extent Scandinavia as well, you tend to have, where you have this kind of stakeholder governance, you tend to have often some form of co-determination, as it's called in these countries, where you have some form of worker representation, workplace kind of democracy. So Germany, having brought this in the early 1950s, essentially after the Second World War. So you get this kind of, yeah. So what we were quite interested in was that Berlin means didn't really, they're very much managerialists. They're at the kind of the forefront of the managerial revolution before people like Peter Drucker get involved, and before certainly people like Alfred Chandler, for example, really start filling it out in some ways. They're kind of sort of saying, okay, well, managers are the professional, educated, dispassionate people, if you like, who are capable of governing firms and allocating societal resources, if you like, within firms, and that's their kind of role, is to allocate these kind of firm resources. So so you have that kind of idea going on, but they don't ascribe much possibility to workers for doing this, or potential to workers for doing this, and so that was one of our interests, because then we discovered that around this same time, actually, there had been a worker representation movement in the United States, and Berle advised FDR as part of the kind of Brains Trust and the kind of setting up of the New Deal by people like Wagner and so on. So the interesting thing here is that the New Deal comes in, and this is seen in the US as kind of a shift in some ways to the left, right? To the left in kind of policy terms in some ways, okay? But at the same time, actually, it kind of closes down the possibilities for co-determination. So as, so as the New Deal comes in, it's very much a kind of managerialist New Deal, if you like. It's assumed that these kind of benevolent managers who are, not responsible, theoretically they're responsible to shareholders, but are they responsible to shareholders? Come in, and the idea is okay, you shareholders are going to trust the managers to make the right decisions for you, but also, and this is the other interesting thing, they're also going to be trusted to redistribute for employees in the right kinds of way as well. So this is quite interesting. So that kind of spurred us to look in more depth at this issue of employee representation as a kind of, initially as a kind of sub area, but it's now become a big, as happens in research, it's become a bigger project in its own right. I mean, this is quite interesting to me. I've never really worked on kind of lower level human relations type material before, but it's quite interesting, this area of kind of labor history and how it feeds back into overall governance, if you like. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from, and that's what led us towards Hagley.
Sure.
So Hagley being, yeah, Karen.
Well, what Hagley collections then did you use for your research?
Yeah, so Hagley was a good place to start, obviously, as the kind of, so certainly even from the UK, we consider it to be one of, the main, or the leading sort of American repository, because it just kind of brings together so much stuff, right? And so we had a look through, and we talked to people like Lucas Clausen there, who were very helpful. And actually your team are very, very helpful. I've been to many archives around the world, but I thought that the Hagley team's particularly passionate about what they do, and I think this is quite exciting, and it's quite good in itself. It felt, it felt good to be somewhere where it's clear that kind of knowledge is being pursued for, research is being pursued for its own sake in some ways as well. But yeah, in terms of actual collections, we looked at, so I think I looked at 4 collections roughly. So I looked at another bits and bobs as well. So I used materials from both the archives and the library, but particularly useful in the archives were on microfilm, you have the records of a company called Leeds and Northrop, a small engineering firm who made, I think, kind of scientific instruments and instruments for boilers and things like this. So they made kind of precision engineering products, basically. A small firm from Philadelphia, so not very far from Hagley, but they had from 1919 until at least the start of the Second World War an employee representation program that was incredibly well worked out, and better yet, they had kept the archives. So what seems to have happened in some cases when there were employee representation plans. So lots of big firms had them. So General Electric had one, International Harvester, Western Union, some of the Standard Oil. So Rockefeller was very keen on them. So some of the kind of Standard Oil subsidiaries, or after the kind of breakup, under the sorry, my voice is going out. After the breakup under the Sherman Acts, then the Standard Oil subsidiaries started having them as well. So yeah, so a lot of firms had them, but not many seem to have kept them as part of the corporate archive, if you like. So in some cases, because it's, they were called cooperative organizations or associations, in some cases that the actual representation scheme was, and it was slightly separately constituted. So in some cases, the records of this haven't survived in particular detail or in particular depth within the corporate archive. So because Morris Leeds, who is the president of Leeds and Northrop, kind of saw the cooperative association, as he called it, or as the company called it, they saw it as a big part of what they were doing. They then kept it within their overall corporate archive, which is microfilmed and given to Hagley. So this is quite useful to be able to go through on the microfilm machine at Hagley. So I looked at quite a lot of the records of it, and it has quite complete meeting minutes and this sort of thing. So it was more complete than. So you also have stuff from Bethlehem Steel, who, right, so very complete, fantastically. If you're a historian of Bethlehem Steel in itself, say this would be a dream, because you have very, very complete boxes of paper, records of that, but just a few folders within those boxes, just a few kind of the slimmer line folders within it of the employee representation plan. Same for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So the Pennsylvania Railroad's files take up a whole wall, right? And I've seen Al Torella's fantastically thick book on the first, and that's supposed to be the first volume, right? On the, but again, you've got some quite good records of its employees representation plan, but they're fairly. So there's quite a lot of documents from it, but again, not really many minutes. So there's a lot of kind of the public relations about it. There's a lots of things like talking about it in abstract, how many cases they resolved through it, and things like this. But there's not as much detail necessarily about the actual meeting. So the Leeds and Northrop file seemed to be the best one that I've seen. There's also some stuff in the SEPTA files, the transport transport organization for Philadelphia and around files, which was a private company in the 1920s and also had an employee representation plan. But again, I didn't find that the files were there and that weren't quite as good. But the other thing is the employee representation plan there was quite well documented in some cases compared to others. So the Leeds and Norfolk files are good because what you have is you have basically kind of monthly meetings of its committee. It's one of these cases where there's almost too much, which is good, right? So, so it did take quite a lot of time for me to work out what was going on in some ways. But you have kind of monthly meetings of the committee there. You have the kind of policy documents. You can, to some extent, also look at the board minutes of the company as a whole. So the other thing is that what's annoying in a lot of corporate archives is that the board minutes are kept by the company themselves, right? So in some cases, this is also an issue. But the great thing is that you've got the Leeds and Norfolk kind of executive committee minutes, as it called it, and then as they call it, and then you've got the board, you've got the minutes of the cooperative association as well. So you can see to some extent the goings on between them, and what the two bodies are doing and what they're talking about. So this was quite interesting and quite useful. And when I kind of hit on this, I kind of realized that this is quite a good kind of collection to go through, if you like. So even though it can be difficult to get things off microfilm at times, it's a very, very good kind of holding. It's very complete. It's one of these things where you can one of the things that's quite good when you're working with archives is being able to work out, what you're looking at. But then when you've got big loads of documents, if there's a kind of regular pattern, like a meeting minute, and then you get that list of participants every month and this kind of thing, then it gives you a structure to work with, right? So the Leeds and Norfolk files have that have that structure, and it's really good. And we can get into some of the stuff that they're kind of talking about there. So it's quite interesting. It's really interesting from that perspective. Is sort of you can see, what the organization actually did. So it seems to be quite a good case study. And yeah, we're going to make that particular case study central to a paper that we're now putting together for a big management journal around this topic, if you like. It's going to try and look at what are the impacts of employee voice coming through a cooperative organization like Leeds and Northrop had, essentially. So how did it impact the firm? What did these cooperative organizations or corporate associations, if you like, actually do? Was it kind of was it good in terms of strategy or innovation, for example, or was it more of a kind of a body for collective bargaining and this kind of thing? So this was our kind of this was what we were sort of looking for there. The interesting thing there was that we had one theory that so there's some work done on the steel industry, particularly by Dan Wren, who the management historian, who's shown that in the sort of Great Depression period, particularly, employee representation plans were quite useful at kind of improving productivity and innovation in the steel industry, because the thing was is that you could talk to employees and they would spot things that the management didn't, essentially. So you break down that agency problem, if you like, or you you kind of draw on the kind of shop floor knowledge, if you like, of the staff, and people are saying, well, okay, we're doing it this very inefficient way. It would be better if we could just do this, or something like that. So we did think originally that might be one reason, or one additional driver, if you like, for having company unions or company registration, employee representation rather, structures. However, we don't see that surfacing as much in the Leeds and Norfolk files, or in fact in the Bethlehem Steel ones either, really. So this is quite interesting. They do have suggestion schemes and this kind of thing, and there is a safety committee that look at kind of minor, it looks at ongoing safety kind of details in the factory, but the records of that part of it aren't as good. So we don't see kind of detailed minutes all the time of it. It crops up from time to time, but and things like doors in sheds that are causing the shed to be closed, and could it be opened in the summer and cold rather than could it be opened in the summer? Could it be closed in the winter? Things like this are coming up. But we don't really see kind of hard innovation material kind of coming through. And the other sense I got from, so what I did was I went through the minutes of the Cooperative Association first, and then I thought, well, we're probably only seeing, we're seeing kind of their side of it here, but what if I look now at the executive minutes as well? And yeah, I didn't see much evidence there that they were engaging them in. So I wouldn't say that they're engaging them in strategic decision making around new products or anything like this particularly. So this is quite interesting, and some of the writings of Maurice Leeds himself are also in the microfilm as well, and they're quite useful as well because he gives quite a lot of useful context there. So he talks about wanting to involve the employees in things which impact them more directly. And his view of that is that it's about wages, conditions, vacations, and all of these sides of it. Overtime comes up a lot, inevitably, in a kind of a factory environment where there might be big orders to do, and so there was more overtime at some points, particularly where this is an engineering factory. So there are cases where it can be kind of feast or famine, where you get more orders and less orders, and so you have an unequal ebb and flow of the workload at times, and particularly through the depression, of course, period, which the files kind of cover. So yeah, so you get that, you get that sense that, so what he's interested in is he's interested in trying to use it as a bargaining platform, really, to some extent. So it's about trying to it's trying to find ways to resolve, or it can be trying to find ways to resolve disputes in the factory without there being unions involved externally, for example. So there's that whole area. Yeah. So
Well, what is the relationship between these internal employee representation schemes
yeah,
and organized labor, more unionism, as as
yeah.
we understand it?
So yeah. Well, the basic answer to that is that organized labor doesn't like it or didn't like it, right? So so this is one of the it's one of the big kind of the factors that comes around it. So Samuel Gompers himself, then the president of the AFL, is pretty much argues that, he says in, I think it's 1921, that the industrial representation bodies are basically actually, they're impeding industrial democracy, because the unions basically see them as rival bodies that are set up by the the companies to substitute for organized labor. So I think, so this issue is that, some of it is about union substitution. Some of it's actually about union suppression. Not surprisingly, a lot of labour historians have argued more for the latter, that it's about union suppression. To some extent, I think it can be illustrated more as union substitution. It's quite complicated, because it appears that in the Leeds case, the employees are actually quite happy to be represented, for example, by this body. And when the Wagner Act comes in 1935, when it's going through Congress, the employees of the firm actually submit. They get together and get 700 signatures against the Wagner Act, and it's a firm that at that time employs about 800 people. So, they have, that there is a genuine sense there that people do want to engage with this in a meaningful way, and they're not as interested in organized labor in the same sense. So so organized labor certainly sees it as a rival, and I think, again, where you look at Bethlehem Steel Materials and that kind of end of it, you get a lot of stuff there from management talking about how brilliant and harmonious it is that they've avoided having to deal with external unions. So I think there is an element there, certainly, of union suppression, but certainly I think the Leeds case is more of a case of kind of union substitution. And obviously, either way, the formal trade union or labour unions don't want to be seen as being substituted. And then the danger is they equate that then to suppression, I think, as well. So there's a difference there, though, however, between that suppression and between substitution and suppression. So there's a difference there. So and it's quite complicated to tease out which is going on at different times. But a lot of this comes from, the movement as a whole grows out of the First World War to a large extent. So there had been earlier experiments with it. So the Filene department store in Boston was one of the earliest to have a system of industrial representation. And this was kind of Boston's leading department store. And this had it as early as 1898. So they have a cooperative association that Leeds and Northrop one appears in some ways to be based on. But then what you get from around the First World War is a sense that this is a way to increase productivity through the First World War and then into the early post-war period as well. And then you get bodies like the the National Industrial Conference Board, for example, being set up to further these. So by the early 1920s, there's something like 250 organizations that have employee representation bodies. It's just unfortunate that probably more evenly spread records didn't quite make it through. But yeah, so the National Industrial Conference Board becomes a body that starts to draw together these kinds of different experiences, and you get various people kind of as well, kind of campaigning for them as well. So Leitch is a big proponent of this idea, and he pushes forward he writes a book in 1919 which pushes forward an idea that you should have a representation body which is actually based on Congress, of a House of Representatives and a Senate and a president and all this kind of thing, right? So there's some organizations where they actually do copy the US kind of constitution in quite literal ways, and they're actually literally bringing democracy into the organization. You see, so this is quite interesting. And then there's a guy called Holbrook Porter as well who pushes it again from an innovation point of view. So he argues again that having industrial democracy will lead to kind of new perspectives and new ideas emerging. We don't kind of see this to the same extent that we were hoping to see. So I think this is one of the puzzles that kind of still remains here to some extent. But yeah, I think it is quite interesting that a lot of the discussion that goes on tends to be around these areas of overtime bargaining. It certainly helps. So it helps the Leeds and Northrop Company get through the Depression, certainly, because the employees accept a wage cut, and they accept kind of doing less hours to try and avoid redundancies at one point as well. So there are quite good kind of there are some good positive kind of productivity effects, if you like.
Well, how was that body constituted? The employee representative body in Leeds and Northrop?
So in the Leeds and Northrop case, they didn't copy Congress, but what they did have was they basically had a council of about 25 members. So its membership kind of varies, but I would say it was more based on a kind of municipal organization in their case. So you had a central council of about 25 members elected by each shop, right? So you had obviously the different departments and shops of the factory, and they elected representatives directly into this. So there is a bit of a kind of there's a constituency system, or a what do you call it in America, a district system in there. So you have a kind of a first past the post system going on within it. Yeah. You don't really get factions emerging, as far as I can tell. So there isn't really a party system or anything within it, but you do get. But some of the companies, I think some of the Leeds and Northrop ballot papers survive. Certainly for the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Bethlehem Steel files that you have, they actually made sure they kept the ballot papers and copies of some of the ballot papers. So they are arranged like kind of political ballot papers and all this kind of thing. Yeah, and they have secret ballots and all this sort of thing. The Leeds and Northrop one, it had that 25-member council, and then what they had was they had committees as well, subcommittees. So some people that aren't on the council are also kind of co-opted onto these subcommittees. So there's a subcommittee for safety, for example. There's a subcommittee for things like conditions. There's a parking subcommittee at one point. Right, so there are different subcommittees. There's a sports subcommittee and a social subcommittee. There's a glee club at one point, which is associated with it. So there's kind of like social kind of committees, and then there are more kind of serious kind of committees as well, which kind of descended from it, if you like. So they have this kind of committee structure, which different people that are interested in different topics essentially are invited to join. So what you then have is actually a system that, I suppose when you think about it being a factory of 800 people, quite a lot of people are then co-opted in some way onto this committee system and feel that they have a consultative stake, if you like, in the setup. So yeah, so that is the way that it ends up being kind of structured, if you like. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, you get that whole you get this whole kind of system of discussion set up, and then you get um, that then allows for consultation to come up as well in different ways, and this can cover all sorts of topics. So certainly, wage and working condition kind of issues around overtime and vacations are by a long way the most kind of frequently discussed things. But then you also get little insights into everyday factory life as well at the same time. So one of the discussions that comes up is whether or not there should be vending machines, and what types of vending machines should there be, and can there be in an almost kind of Homer Simpson like moment, there's kind of like, can we have candy machines as well? One of the requests that comes up, and the executive committee tried to discourage it on health grounds. There are discussions about, can we have milk machines? Cigar machines is another one that comes up. So they're quite keen to allow the milk machines, less so cigar machines, for example. So there are, so there's a kind of a there are lots of kind of. So I think what you can say about it is that it allows for kind of a bargaining about conditions in the factory that are probably broader than would happen between a union a labour union in the traditional sense, which would very much probably stick to paying conditions, right? To and maybe kind of demarcation of roles and this kind of thing to some extent, but um, yeah, you get a broader discussion going on there. I think the other thing that's going on is that it creates a sense of a social life around the organisation because it has that sporting and social side. So again, there's an athletics union, and they're doing things like they're organising badminton in the canteen, right, and things like this on Saturdays, or fencing, I think was another one that comes up. So it's not just kind of big American kind of field sports that they're doing, if they're doing them at all. It's the ones that come up seem to be things like fencing and tennis and or badminton, or things like so. So it's quite interesting that there's all sorts of different sort of activities going on around it. They have a show every year at Christmas, I think, as well. This kind of comes up to the organised kind of theatre performances. So probably this is giving the factory more of a kind of a social life than it would do, and in this very soft way, then it's kind of encouraging cohesion, I think, and encouraging a very certain well, certainly it encourages an adherence to the company union because people see the tangible kind of benefits and the sort of soft factors that help to build the kind of the community around the plant. So it's not just a 9 to 5 thing; it's more than that. It kind of fosters loyalty as well, if you like, which is quite interesting. So it's not just about constructing HRM incentives. So there's a lot of ideas around kind of strategic HRM nowadays, and the idea that you should try and construct work incentives and manage people's workloads according to this. And it's not so much about work incentivization. Often it seems as trying to build around around it and giving the employees a kind of a stake in feeling that they're building something around the organization as well. So that's quite an interesting kind of facet of it. Another issue that keeps coming up is parking, intriguingly. So there's kind of like the employees are like, well, we should have a parking lot, and then the next thing is that we don't have enough security in the parking lot, and things like cars are getting broken into and all this kind of thing. so even that kind of side of it is quite it's quite interesting how it comes up as well. So I think it's quite interesting in that sense. So I suppose you can say that it gives employees, or it seemed to have given employees, a stake in the business. And certainly when the government tried to, or the Wagner Act tried to abolish it. So the Wagner Act basically made it almost impossible, or has made it almost impossible for American organizations to have employee representation schemes after 1935, because what it kind of stipulates is that managers can't be involved in the organization of employee representation schemes, nor can they even support them. So the idea was is that Wagner um, very much saw employee representation schemes as union suppression as such, rather than substitution. And so this is what they were trying to stamp out, was a sense
I
that,
see.
and I suppose there is a sense that, okay, you could say that maybe there's a conflict of interest as well. So there's a case for arguing that, I mean, it's not something I personally believe as such, but I would say that you could argue that, okay, maybe there's a conflict of interest in managers being involved, and that maybe you do need an independent person to come forward and and that's there's one point of view there that you can advance in that direction, right? So because of this, the Wagner Act ended up legalizing this. I think the longer term problem that's come from this has been that the long run, as you moved away from the kind of the managerialist model towards a more overtly shareholder management kind of model in the US, then what you've ended up doing is kind of as it is just ending up with a kind of a confrontational arrangement between the unions and employers, and so that's meant that, you know, as we get into the 21st century, newer employers have tried to avoid having unions altogether, so you get a lot of organizations today, like, you know, in the service sector and so on, where employees have no voice whatsoever. So a good recent case was Google, where employees, um, as Google has got bigger, it appears that employees have kind of lost voice gradually, as happens in a lot of organizations, but there's no unionization in Google's sector, right? Or very little, because it's such a new sector. And so employees there, actually, they've campaigned for employee voice, some form, to be introduced, or whether it be unionization or a representation scheme or whatever it is. We also see in some cases American firms keeping up their representation schemes in Canada, for example, after they're legalized in the US. So we know that actually American firms weren't necessarily actually opposed to them. In fact, sometimes the opposite. So yeah, so it's quite an interesting kind of situation. But the Wagner Act, I think it's the unintended consequence of well-meaning legislation, essentially, right? Because the view has been out. You know, so sometimes these organisations are called company unions, and this is meant in quite a derogatory frame, right? So it's sort of saying, well, yeah, these are things which,
A pet union.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, but again, you know, another argument that comes up here often as well. You know, Germany has enjoyed much stronger productivity growth than that enjoyed, you know, post Second World War than by the US and also the UK, where again we had a similar national movement around the First World War period towards industrial councils, and then moved away from it as well, in a fairly similar pattern towards a much more confrontational mode of industrial relations. So yeah, so that broader kind of narrative fits and flows into it, if you like. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be kind of looking at this. I think we do have to be careful. So the historical context matters. So one of the things that now, in terms of negatives, if you like, or what disadvantages of this kind of structure. So one of the other interesting things that happened was that as the depression got worse in Leeds and Northrop, the male employees started to argue for married women to be disbarred from working at the firm, for example. So there were never lots of married women. There were only about 5% of the employee base. And of course, it being that kind of, so this is why context matters, because obviously the women are never referred to at any point in the minutes as women, right? So they're always gendered. They're always called girls, even if they're married women. Well, apart from when they're wanting to ban married women from working in the factory, in which case they are called married women. But generally speaking, they're always called girls, and you can identify them being, they're not kind of disbarred from voting or anything. So they are on the committee. You can see their names, Miss such and such. They appear there in the minutes, they appear, and you know that they are women because everybody else doesn't have a title, and then they have Miss next to the name. So the kind of gender norms, if you like, of the period are kind of upheld there. But yeah, the danger there, but the interesting thing that's inherent in this is that they first start campaigning for it in 1934, I think it is, and this time the board say, no, we're not doing it. So they bring it to the executive board, and they basically say, well, no, we're not, we don't really want to entertain this, we're not. And then they bring it back in 1938. So they managed to hang on to their organisation for a bit longer after the Wagner Act. And they bring it back as a topic in 1937 to 38. And in this time, the board do give in, essentially say, okay, we will have a married bar, but we won't get rid of married women that are already working here, but we won't hire any new ones. So the interesting thing is that you can sometimes kind of formal labour unions are criticised for being quite protectionist of particular labour bodies, or particular professions. So you can get kind of demarcation in which only people that have had certain training can do certain jobs, or this kind of thing that labour unions can uphold. Well, in a similar sense, you can also get defensive movements happening from employee representation schemes in the same way as well. So the danger that you have inherent with them is that they might not actually increase diversity. So it's sometimes suggested, what you need to increase the diversity of opinion and ideas within the running of an organization is an employee representation scheme. The danger is that they can actually be, if you like, captured by the dominant group in an organization to actually reduce diversity and reduce competition, if you like. And although you probably wouldn't now vote, for example, to exclude married women, there are different political agendas around that could conspire to capture such an organization, maybe, or things like this. So certainly there's a risk of that inherent within it. So yeah, there can be, in some ways, conservative organizations as well, or protectionist organizations too. So that's the downside, in a sense, is that if you're going to give people democracy, then they will use democracy in some different ways that you might not anticipate again. So yeah, so there are particular downsides, if you like, or risks that can emerge with representation schemes such as this.
Yeah. And it sounds like that's a pretty important implication given the current policy level of interest in policy circles around this idea.
Yeah, so this is the risk that could emerge, is that so these ideas would be, or these kind of schemes are novel, would be essentially novel to the US because nobody within living memory has had them. There's also been evidence from Germany, for example, of employee representation schemes where German employees have voted to exclude immigrant workers or people from different countries other than Germany, for example, and things like this at different times or within different frames. So it can sometimes, even in cases of good practice, be used as more of an exclusory, or they can even forbid certain categories of worker from joining the scheme or things like this. That didn't happen in the Morrison Leeds case, but you could see that it could happen in cases where you might say that only permanent workers, say, somewhere could be allowed to join it, and then that could end up with there being a large second class of temporary workers within an organisation. And obviously, precarity and these kinds of things in modern organisations are a big issue, right? So it could be that you end up with structures like that being formed. One scheme that Leeds also tried was to allow only people. So he actually changed the voting rights and governance arrangements of the company so that people that were earning more than $1,500 a year and who'd worked for Morrison Leeds for more than 5 years could buy shares, and then they would be the only shareholders that were allowed an actual vote in the company as well. So he tried this as well. There isn't any kind of statistics to show, unfortunately, how successful this is. But we suspect that probably not many of the employees took up the opportunity to buy shares after they'd been at Morrison Leeds for 5 years, because you wouldn't want to double invest yourself in your. So there's a strong disincentive against buying into your own employer, sometimes, in the sense that you don't want to have your eggs in one basket, right? So, so we're not certain that many employees actually tried this, but he did try that approach as well. But it stopped short of the firm being an overall cooperative, if you like, because it's not putting, and where, yeah, I mean, I think this is important to be clear about as well, is that what Leeds had, or what Leeds and Norfolk had, really was a kind of they had a dual system of, so the board was one thing and workers were here. In some cases, what you're now talking about is having worker reps on boards and things like this. But how does that work? How does that align itself? It's not clear. What does that person actually do? Are they just a non-executive director in kind of modern parlance? Do they turn up, and just sort of nod in the corner? I don't. Yeah. So, so there are risks like this inherent in the idea. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think I think it's probably, our kind of the Leeds and Norfolk evidence kind of shows that in some ways these kind of bodies can be more useful than not, because it provides a frame for resolving conflicts and all of these sorts of things. And I think that can be useful in an organization. The danger is that at the same time, if not constituted carefully, you can also have unintended consequences arising out of it as well. And I think that's the other side of it. I'm not convinced, though, that you could sell it to organizations on the basis of, say, improving innovation, or necessarily. It might improve safety, I think, and operational efficiency in some ways, but it's probably but it's more of a soft factor than a hard factor, if you like. It's more, if you get people invested in an organization in a soft way, then they're more likely to be interested in improving kind of safety and conditions and working practices, and getting rid of inefficient working practices and this kind of thing, and than they will be if they're prevailed upon in a hard way, if you like. Yeah. So yeah, but so I think they're probably more good than not. But at the same time, we have to be careful about exactly what benefits these things will bring, and there has to be a kind of measured discussion about it. Of course, as far as I perceive things contemporarily, the possibility of measured discussion seems very few sometimes, but but there has to be a clear idea of what these bodies are for. And actually, that's probably partly why they ended up being suppressed essentially in the 1930s, was because of that ambiguity about, what were they for? It's quite interesting to actually look at what they actually did as well, which is where the access to the materials at Hagley was really useful. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you're able to have so much benefit from the access to the materials, and thank you so much for sharing your work with me today.
Yeah. And well, I look forward to being able to come back to Hagley at some point, because I really enjoyed that as well. It was great. It's perfect to be. So in the modern academic environment, it's very difficult to get kind of that sort of relaxed, kind of out of the way, remove, kind of atmosphere that's really useful for sort of thinking as well, and that kind of thing. So Hagley has that, and this is a real advantage of it as well. So it was great for that, to just be able to go there and sort of crack on and look through, get these boxes, get these microfilms, look through them, take loads of photos. This is perfect environment for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for saying so, and we can't wait to see you again.
Yeah.
Once world conditions permit.
Once things improve, yeah. Yeah. I'm glad it was this year. I'm glad it was last year and not this year. That reason. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
well, thanks a lot, Kevin.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me. Yeah.
Sure.